know that mainly what I write is kind of literary criticism and literary history, and kind of interested mainly in the British Empire and India, which is a kind of period usually associated with war, conquest, adventure. But what I'm interested in are the other stories from that period, those that have been somewhat marginalised or lost or overlooked. And I'm going to tell one of those stories today. So this is the story of Annie Besant, who is Britain's first yogi. I'm kind of tentatively putting a question mark after yogi at the moment, because I'm not 100% sure that she's definitely Britain's first yogi, but at this point in my research, I'm making this bold statement. Does anybody know Annie Besant? No. Some people may have heard of her, yeah. And certainly Victorian scholars do know about her. She was born in 1847, lived in 1933. And she's mostly famous as a feminist and a socialist, not as a yogi. But in 1907, she wrote a book called Introduction to Yoga. And I think it was probably the first one by a Western author. So if anyone here has done yoga, we have Annie to thank for that. She was born in London to Irish parents and married Frank Besant in 1867, who was a clergyman. And at first they seemed to sort of go along being quite similarly socially motivated. But in 1873 they separated, at least in part because of differences around kind of religious, political and gender issues. They couldn't divorce. It was socially and economically kind of difficult for middle-class people at this time. And eventually Frank ended up gaining custody of both of their children, partly because Besant was a campaigner for birth control, and he used this to declare her an unfit mother. And so around this time, Annie begins to question her beliefs in the Anglican Church, and in particular the way that the Church controlled people's lives. Like many people at the time, she went on to search for kind of alternative ideologies. She was very spiritual, so she was looking for alternative ideologies through which to live, and eventually in 1889 converted to Theosophy, which again some of you may have heard of. It was a Western esoteric movement and belief system that sought a kind of spiritual emancipation and universal brotherhood. In contrast to much Western philosophy and ideology at the time, which was quite imperialist in nature and viewed the East as inferior, Theosophy and the Theosophists looked to India for inspiration, in particular India's religions. It was kind of a turnaround from what the mainstream was doing. Mainstream kind of discourse at the time saw India as a land of superstition and poverty, and the Theosophists started kind of challenging that with this image of India as a place of great gurus and esoteric knowledge. They used a lot of Hindu and Buddhist teachings, including karma, reincarnation, Kundalini, the chakras, and they were started to get interested then through this in yogic teachings. And at this time there was one particular guru who was bringing yoga to people's attention in the West, the Swami Vivekananda. And Besant went to hear him speak at the Parliament of Religions in Chicago, and she described his experience as this: purposeful, virile, strong, he stood out, a man among men, able to hold his own, always subdued to the exquisite beauty of the spiritual message which he had brought, to the sublimity of that matchless truth of the East, which is the heart and life of India, the wondrous teachings of the Self. Enraptured, the huge multitude hung upon his words. Not a syllable must be lost, not a cadence missed. That man a heathen, said one as he came out of the great hall, and we send missionaries to his people, it would be more fitting that they should send missionaries to us. He had spoken about the interconnectedness of all religions, delivered a kind of powerful alternative to the idea of a world that was linked, at this time mainly through loyalty to and a kind of domination of the British flag. And he instead was sort of preaching that different cultures, different religions, different societies should be more united. He argued that all religions ultimately shared the same goal and offered a philosophy based on the yogic teachings of the 4th century Indian guru Patanjali. Vivekananda's yoga was mainly about a kind of spiritual philosophy, so he did acknowledge the need for asanas, which are our physical postures, our downward dogs and so on. And he acknowledged those as a way of training the body to kind of train the mind in a sense. But for him, it was much more about just simply preparing the body for the meditative state of the mind. And his focus was more in the kind of spiritual and mental teachings. And these are what Besant took forward in her book, An Introduction to Yoga. Like Vivekananda, she wanted to find a spiritual practice that didn't belong to a dominant church, that allowed for the freedom of the mind and the freedom of the individual. She sought a way to transcend doctrines of separation, such as Christian and imperial identities, and she supported, along with this, she kind of got very involved with the nationalist movements of both Ireland and India. She argued that the spiritual ideal of yoga was to find a unity of the self, and that's kind of ultimately what yoga means is union, body and mind, body and soul. And this emerges through a process of self-realization. For Besant, this was important because for her it was the way in which people could become truly united. Yoga was therefore not just a way to find peace within, but also peace without. A way to actually resist colonial politics and that sought to sort of subjugate and separate all the different nations, races and religion. So in her book she has a very complex description of how one can achieve self-realization, and then she sort of concludes by setting out the ultimate purpose of this spiritual journey. So she writes, "What is to be the end of this long struggle? What is the goal of the upward climbing, the prize of the great battle? What does the yogi reach at last? He reaches unity. Sometimes I'm not sure that large numbers of people, if they realize what unity means, would really desire to reach it. There are many virtues of your ordinary life which will drop entirely away from you when you reach unity. Many things you admire will no longer help, but hindrances when the sense of unity begins to dawn. All those qualities so useful in ordinary life, such as moral indignation, I don't know how useful that is, but moral indignation, repulsion from evil and judgment of others, have no room when unity is realized. A man who knows unity cannot judge another. For him there is no I or thee, for we are one. And this is not a thing that many honestly wish for. It's not a thing that many honestly desire. The man who's realized unity knows no difference between himself and the vilest wretch that walks the earth. He sees only God in that sinner, and knows that the sin is not in the God but in the sheep. The difference is only there. He who has realized the inner greatness of the self never pronounces judgment upon another, knows that other as himself, and he himself as that other. That is unity. We talk of brotherhood, but how many of us really practice it? And even that is not the thing the yogi aims at. Greater than brotherhood are identity and realization of the self as one, because this will allow us to realize the unity of the human race, to catch a glimpse of the beauty of that high conception, the greatness of the unity in which I and mine and you and yours have vanished, in which we are all but one life." So kind of bold claims for a time when politics were based on kind of differentiations of colour and creed and gender. And so perhaps something to bear in mind next time you find yourself in a downward dog, that the original purpose of yoga was to find unity and as a kind of resistance to a lot of Western ideology. Thank you.